Today, we're answering the age-old question, when is the right time to pull out your winter plants to make room for spring? So a lot of the time, the answer to that is going to be once your winter plants have produced or start to putter out and are no longer really giving you what you want, or perhaps they're bolted. But in my case, it's I need the bed for something else, so the winter plants are on their way out. So this week I did a huge harvest. I'm going to show you all about that. We're going to go through and harvest everything to get everything out of the way, or most of the things out of the way, so that we can plant our tomatoes. I'm going to show you the process I go through to transplant my tomatoes. And then we're going to take some of that harvest and we're going to make sauerkraut. We're going to take all that cabbage that we're harvesting and we're going to go inside and I'm going to show you exactly how I make my sauerkraut so that it is perfect and tangy. Come along, guys, let's go have some fun. My original intent was just to clear this one bed, and I was kind of looking at it and I'm like, you know, I've got a lot of stuff in here. I have some cabbage, I've got some cauliflower, I have Brussels sprouts and celery, and I was like, okay, I can clear out everything except the Brussels sprouts, which should give me the space I need. But then as I started harvesting, I don't know if you guys are like this, but I'm definitely like this. Once I start harvesting, I start looking around the rest of the garden and seeing what else can be harvested and what else I can take inside, because something about these big harvests just, I don't know, just make me love the garden even more. I did a little bit more than just this one bed, but to start out, I did pull the cauliflower off. This cauliflower I had been growing, and I had taken the leaves and wrapped it around the cauliflower head to make sure that they stayed nice and white. Now, cauliflower is not like broccoli, so once you cut it from the plant, it's not going to start sprouting more broccoli. I mean, I think there's some varieties that do a little bit of sprouting, but it's not really enough that it makes sense to leave the plant there. So you'll see that I'm taking these plants off right at the base, and then I pull the leaves off, and then I will cut the stem down to where there's only about an inch or half an inch left of the stem at the base of the cauliflower. And then to store the cauliflower, all I do is I put it in a little baggie and I put it in the refrigerator in the crisper drawer. This was an awful lot, so it ended up on a shelf. And then for the cabbages, it's kind of the same process. You take the outer leaves off, and then I cut the stem within an inch. And these will last a long time in your fridge. I actually just put them in some grocery bags, some plastic grocery bags, tie them closed, and put them in the very back bottom shelf where it gets nice and cold, and they will last for months this way. But the sauerkraut we're going to make later is another way that you can make your cabbage last even longer if you're into sauerkraut. You're probably noticing that these heads are not very big, and I know that. I could have definitely left them longer to continue to grow larger, but honestly, I needed this bed for these tomatoes, and then this little portion of this bed right here where I'm actually taking them out as well is for the peppers, because the peppers are going to go in right after the tomatoes. I may not do them today. I'll probably do them tomorrow or maybe even later on in the week. So while I was thinking of these tomatoes, I was thinking, man, I've got to make space for all these other things, and that's probably why I led down this road of harvesting way more than what I intended to harvest for the day. Now, these cabbages right here are a little interesting because they're starting to get tall, and tall to me means bolting. And so I took both of these out because I think that they are starting to bolt, and they taste fine. I tasted them and they don't taste bitter or anything, so they're not quite to that point yet, but I could tell that they probably weren't going to get much bigger because all they were doing was growing upwards. That tells me that it's just getting a little too hot for them, and while they are small, they do the job just like any other cabbage head. They're just, they're just small. Now that we have the cabbage all taken care of and the cauliflowers done, I wanted to get the celery out as well. And I'm cutting them once again right at the base. Now you can grow celery two different ways, or you can harvest celery two different ways. You can cut it at the base like I'm doing here, where the whole stem stays attached with all of the branches. Or you can do the cut and come again method. I did this last year and it worked out really well, where I would cut the stalks off as I needed them and use them and let the plant continue to grow. But it is heating up so fast here that this celery is not going to taste good very soon if I don't get it out of my garden, because celery does not handle hot weather, and we have been getting up into the 80s during the day, just the low 80s, but still the 80s, and celery does not like that level of temperature. So I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take them all out. When I preserve my celery, I like to do it two different ways. I will chop it up into small pieces, vacuum seal it, and freeze it. You don't even need to blanch it. If you wanted them to last, 6, 9, 12 months, you probably should blanch them so that they hold better. And then the other way I like to keep them is freeze dried. So now that I have a freeze dryer, I've started freeze drying them, and that is a really great way of preserving celery. To keep them in the fridge, I will store them in a dish towel. I'll wrap them in a dish towel, and that usually keeps them good in the refrigerator for probably a month or two. It's pretty good. While I was out here, I was like, you know what, let's get some of this broccoli. I have these broccoli plants where the main head has already been harvested, so what I have left are all these little side shoots. The side shoots at this point are getting very small, and that's typically what happens, okay? So you don't have any side shoots, you harvest the main head, and then you start getting these very large side shoots. I mean, some of them are quite big. And I'll harvest those, and after that round, they start getting smaller and smaller and thinner because the plant is wanting to bolt. So after this round, I actually got rid of that plant completely because I just don't think it's going to produce anything of substance. These are the Romanescas. I don't know if they will actually create side shoots, so I'm actually taking the plant out anyway because I'm going to be putting green beans in this bed, or beans, dried beans and green beans in this bed. This plant as well, this one, once again, those side shoots are just getting small at this point. It's becoming a very bushy plant. It's not producing like the really big side shoots anymore, so this one's going to get taken out as well. Now that we're done with the broccoli, we are moving on to another bed. This one, there's no rhyme or reason. There's not like I need this bed for anything. I just felt like taking the kohlrabi out. Kohlrabi is not one of those plants that you want to leave until they get like super big, because they get very woody very quickly to the point that they are completely inedible. And so I like to take them off at this size because this size is like perfect. They were so tender, so nice. And then this is our little basket. I've already filled this basket up, so I'm going to take this inside and we're going to empty it out so that I can make room for the next thing that we're going to harvest, which is super exciting. I am going to chest out and see how my carrots are doing. The carrots are nice and high. They're the height that I would normally pull them out at. And there's two ways that you can check your carrots. The easiest way is actually to pull one out and look, but I know that you don't want to pull them out too early. I don't like to pull them out too early. So the other way is what I'm doing right here, where I take my finger and I kind of pull the dirt away, and with my finger I will feel where the top of the carrot is. And if that carrot is about, the top of it is about the size of a quarter, I will then pull it out to see how big it is. And you can see here, that's a decent sized carrot, although I think that they will get bigger. So I pull a couple more just to kind of get a test to see where we're at, and I am seeing that they are kind of at that mid-size, but they are at this point going to be growing much, much faster. We're in spring, the number of daylight hours is longer, and now that they are forming roots, they're going to form roots really, really fast. So I think in just a couple weeks, we'll probably be pulling all the carrots out. And then, of course, my biggest win for the season is these beets. I grew 3 types of beets. I grew Early Wonder, Golden Detroit, and I also grew Avalanche. I have not had luck with any beets in years. The first garden that I had, I grew beets, and they did excellent. I didn't even have to do anything. So I thought, oh, beets are easy. And then every year since then, I've tried to grow beets and been completely unsuccessful with beets. This year, I did something against the rules, and I think I showed this in my garden tour, was that I decided to just use nitrogen. Not just nitrogen, right? So there, in these beds has bone meal and kelp meal and normal things that I add to my beds, but I decided that since they were looking so stunted, I was going to give them nitrogen, which goes against everything about growing beets. But hey, it worked. And so I will be doing that going forward from now on. We were completely out of lettuce inside the house, so we're going to go ahead and harvest some of that. This one right here is the Salanova green butter, which is by far one of my favorites of the Salanovas, but the one to the left of it, which is that really fluffy, ruffly lettuce, is the green sweet crisp. That one is really good as well. In fact, guys, any Salanova whatsoever is going to be excellent. They have red varieties, they have green varieties, they have the butter, they have like a bib variety, they had almost like a romaine type variety. They have a bunch of them, and they're very slow to bolt, and they're very, very consistent, and I love the flavor of these lettuces. They're outstanding. I thought that they were hybrids, but when I went to look back at them on Johnny Seeds, because that's like where I buy them from, I think that might be the only place you can get them from. But when I went to look back at them, I noticed that they are open pollinated. And I was like, wait a minute, so they're not hybrids. They are open pollinated plants. I don't think they're considered heirloom because they're a newer variety, but they will seed themselves true to seed, meaning if you save the seeds from these plants, they will produce the same plants, which I think is awesome. And I am going to let a couple of them go to seed so that I can save seed for these, because the seeds are kind of expensive. I'm not going to lie. For lettuce seeds, they're pretty expensive, but considering how consistent they are, how good they are at heat tolerance, how sweet and crisp they stay, it's so worth it to me. And of course, seeds in general are a cheaper economic way, even if they're kind of expensive seeds. Over here, I have some more Salanova that I planted at a second time, and I'm taking these off as leaves instead of as taking the whole head like we did just a second ago. You can harvest lettuce 3 ways. You can harvest it where you just take the stem off the bottom and you take the whole head of lettuce out. It will not regrow in that case. The second way is the way I'm doing right here, which is the cut and gum again, where you just take the outer leaves and you leave the center leaves, and that will continue to grow. And then the third way that I have found worked really well with the Salanovas, it doesn't always work great with other lettuces, but with the Salanovas it works well, is to take a sharp knife and cut about 2 inches above the stem. So leaving kind of a mat of lettuce greens that are 2 inches tall, and you cut all the top parts of it off. It works really well with the sweet crisp, and it worked really well with the butter, the green butter. And it's already, those things are already starting to grow back. Another thing I needed to do was harvest some herbs. I needed to make more Italian seasoning because I haven't made it in a while, not since last spring, and I'm almost out. And I really wanted to try to do it differently this year. I've always dehydrated it, but since I have the freeze dryer now, I wanted to try freeze drying it because I just feel like basil does not hold its flavor well when it's dehydrated. I mean, it's good, but we all love the taste of basil, right? I mean, I'm addicted to it. And when you dehydrate it, it becomes so muted. Now, parsley also becomes muted. Oregano holds its flavor pretty well with dehydrating. But I wanted to take those 3 herbs, oregano, parsley, and basil, and I wanted to freeze dry them to see if the flavors are a little bit better. And I did do that, and they are really exceptional, almost like fresh. But you do have to store them differently. With dehydrated, you put them in a jar and they just hang out in the jar. With freeze dried, you have to try to make sure that there is no air in the jar. So I always have to vacuum seal them, put an oxygen absorber in there so that the moisture in my air doesn't get into the herbs, because they will rehydrate very, very easily just from moisture in the air. The other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to take a lot of the oregano, because I make an oregano tincture. Well, it's not really a tincture. It's a glycerate, I think is how you pronounce it, glycerate. I don't use alcohol when I make my tinctures. I use glycerin because I want a non-alcoholic type of way to make my medicinal recipes. The reason I do that is I just don't have a really healthy relationship with alcohol, so I have avoided it for the last 2 years. And so I didn't want to bring in alcohol into my house and create this temptation for myself. So I use glycerin. Glycerin is a byproduct of like corn, I think it's corn syrup, the production of corn syrup. So it's from the corn plant. And it is technically, I researched this, it is technically an alcohol byproduct, but it doesn't make you drunk. And so it doesn't have that component to it, but it is technically in the family of alcohols. So something to think about. The glycerin medicinal recipes that I make are only going to last for a year. Whereas if you were to use alcohol like vodka or rum even, those will last for 5 years and they'll last very long. They also are going to be more strong. So when you do it with alcohol, your tincture will last longer and it's going to be more intense for the medicinal properties as opposed to glycerin. So it is a negative doing glycerin versus alcohol. But for some of us, you know, we want to give it to our kids, or we want to abstain from alcohol for personal reasons, religious reasons, those things, you can use glycerin in that case. But I said all that to tell you that my brother-in-law absolutely loves my oregano oil. I think he takes it almost every day. So he has used up all of my supply of oregano oil. And so I wanted to get out here and get the oregano harvested, not only for my Italian seasoning that I'm going to make in the freeze dryer, but also so that I can make a nice big batch of oregano oil with the glycerin for his medicinal uses. Now, oregano oil is more commonly used when you have a cold, which has a bad throat, or if you have like a really stuffy nose, because it really helps with that. Besides using oregano oil for cold, we also use it as an anti-inflammatory. So it is something that you can use every day. And with the glycerin, it actually tastes better. It's sweet. It's kind of like corn syrup. We're going to grab some strawberries while we're over here by the green stalks. I am pulling off. It's starting to slow down now. I was pulling off about a pint of strawberries every other day. Now it's getting to be about a pint maybe twice a week. So they are definitely slowing down, although I did see a new flush of flowers come in. So I know that we're getting close to the end of their lives. Now onto the tomatoes. We got all of that cleared out. We got all that processed. All this stuff is in the refrigerator, in the dehydrator, and in the freeze dryer, or in the freezer. So now we have time to work on tomatoes. Tomato transplanting isn't super complicated, but there are a couple nuances to planting tomatoes as opposed to planting most other plants. And the biggest one is how deep you need to plant them. You want to go as deep down into your beds as possible. Tomatoes is one of the few plants that will grow roots all along the stem. So what you see me doing here is trying to dig a hole as deep as possible. Because when I place that tomato plant in, I'm placing it down so that the stem can grow roots below the surface. Now my beds are only about 12 inches deep, but they are open on the bottom. So if I dig down deep enough, I actually get to the ground beneath the bed. Then what I'm going to do is, after I've gotten it as far down as I think I can get it, I am going to add some fertilizer. I'm using plant tone, garden tone, even tomato tone would even be better. Any of those granular fertilizers, probably about 1 to 2 tablespoons. And then what I'm adding also is this mycorrhizin. I used mycorrhizin in the past, and I did a side-by-side comparison, and I was like, it doesn't do anything. I noticed no difference. But then this company, Highlands County, reached out to me, and they said, hey, ours is different. And I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. So last fall, I actually did a comparison of 2 different tomato plants, and it was crazy, the difference in production. So I thought, you know what, let's do all of my tomatoes this year with the mycorrhizin. I did my tomatoes and my peppers. When I planted them, I put just about a teaspoon, and I tap it onto the bottom of the roots of the plant, and then I tip the plant's roots down into the hole as deep as possible, and then you see me pulling the soil back over the plant. So I'll show you how that mycorrhizin does. I'm really expecting some good things, but I had a really great result in fall. I really expect that it's going to be another repeat of that. And then I put a trellis up, and a different kind of trellis, because I have tried all different ways of growing my tomato plants. I've tried the Florida weave, I've tried tomato cages, tomato towers, I've done all kinds of stuff. But this is the way that everyone swears by, and so I'm going to give it a shot and see if it is as good as what everyone says. And so far, as they've been growing, they've been in about a week or two now, as they've been growing, they have done very, very well. Make sure that when you plant them, after you pull that soil back over, you want to water them in really, really well. And I also encourage you to transplant them later in the day when the sun is less intense. We got all our tomatoes in. That's 14 different tomato varieties, because this year I want to show you guys which paste tomato and which beefsteak tomato work the best in spring in Florida or in a southern state, so that we can find the best varieties. And I found a lot of really cool varieties. So we're gonna test this out together, and I will definitely share with you how it goes. So I first picked up one of my cabbages. This one's a little bit older. It's not one of the ones we just picked. So I want to get this used up first. Some of the outer leaves are starting to yellow. So now that I peeled all those off, I'm going to cut this in half and then we're going to shred it into a thin slice. Now you can totally do your sauerkraut in thicker slices. My husband and I just like it fairly thin. I'm just discarding the core so that we don't eat that. And before I run out of room on my cutting board, I'm going to weigh my cabbage. I'm going to weigh my bowl first so that I can subtract it, and then I'm going to weigh the cabbage. And the reason I'm doing that is because for the longest time I put too much salt in my cabbage when I follow like other people's recipes. And that's mainly because the cabbage I grow in my garden tends to be a little bit smaller. I think that's like a Florida thing or a southern climate thing. Our cabbages are just smaller. So when I try to go based off of the measurements that they say to use, I always have trouble because their cabbages are larger and so they weigh more. So instead, the best way that I have found is to actually weigh my cabbage and use 1 to 2% of the salt. So let's weigh our bowl first. I like to use grams. So it is 685. I'm gonna stick this over here. Now you can definitely like reset it to 0, but mine like shuts off after a period of time. So if it has been sitting too long, it will just shut off and I'll forget what the weight of the bowl is. So I try to get the weight of the bowl just in case. So we're gonna cut up the rest of this cabbage. Then we're gonna put that in there. Right now we're at 467. I'm going to do another head of cabbage. I'm going to do a smaller one because I'm really aiming for a certain size here. And that size correlates to how much is going to fit into a quart-sized jar. And I know it's 1,200 grams, but I believe that is with the bowl as well. So if we were at 3 plus 4, yeah, I need a little bit more. This in here. All right, I think we're going to be perfect. You guys would be happy to know I actually got my knives sharpened. I know a few of you had recommended it, and so I did go ahead and get it sharpened, and boy does that make a difference. I actually used a home sharpener. I called around to find somebody who professionally sharpens them, and I did find somebody, but he was backed up like months. So because of that, I was like, you know, is there anything at home that I can use that will sharpen my knives? And so far, we're at 7:15. So far, the ones that I found at home, like the manual ones, they just don't really sharpen, man. They just, I mean, for like a minute they sharpen, and then they're like back to dull. So I bought an electric sharpener now. It was expensive, but it is really nice. I think they recommended it on America's Test Kitchen. I don't watch that show, but I know that there was a lot of reviews about people talking about it being recommended on America's Test Kitchen. So I thought, hey, you know, if they use it, I'm going to give it a shot. And oh, does it work well? It works so well. It sharpened them so well. And I'm really excited that it's something that I can own at home instead of having to take my knife somewhere. So it works really well. All right, so we're at 720. So 1% of 720 is going to be 7.2. And I want to do close to 2%. So that's going to be like 14.4. So I'm going to zero out my scale again. Once we hit 0, then I'm going to grab sea salt. I like sea salt. It seems to work better. And we're going to put enough on there. Ooh, we're at 18 grams. All right, that was a little much. There we go, 16, close enough. A little bit over 2%. You can see how little bit of salt you need. I used to think that you needed like a ridiculous amount of salt, and that is not the case at all. You just need a little bit of salt, especially the sea salt, because the sea salt is heavier. And then, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work that salt in all over the cabbage. And I'm going to do this over a couple hours today. I'm going to let it sit out on the counter, and the salt will cause the moisture to release from the cabbage. And as it does that, I'll just keep kind of massaging it. And then eventually it's going to kind of soften the cabbage enough that it will fit inside the mason jar. So we're going to let this sit for maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll massage it, and then 30 minutes and we'll massage it again. You're not adding any water. You shouldn't need to add water. If you have an especially dry cabbage, you might need to. But I've never had that happen. I've never had a cabbage that won't release enough water. If you let it sit long enough and you keep massaging it and you keep massaging it, that eventually it will release enough water from the cabbage. And it won't seem like it at first. It's not going to be like a puddle of water at the bottom. You're going to start putting in the jar, and as you press down, it will release more liquid until it floats above the cabbage. I'll show you that in just a couple minutes after we let that sit. All right, we have let it sit for probably about, I think it's been like 3 hours now. I went and had a nap. So you can see like it is definitely like wilted down. It's kind of a little bit soggy. And can you see right there? There's liquid in the bottom. That's a perfect sign. Okay. So now we're just going to take a mason jar, and I'm just going to scoop it up with my hands, but you can totally use something more appropriate. Now I'm going to squish it down to really make sure that I get all the room in here. We're going to squish one more time. You can see some of that water coming up, right? But we don't have enough. So I'm not adding any water. I'm using the water from the bowl. So we're pretty close to the liquid is at the top. We're going to do a couple tricks to make sure it gets up there. Now when you're doing sauerkraut, the liquid does expand through the process. We're going to talk about when we ferment it. We're going to go sit it on a shelf. And during that time period, it is going to like fluctuate. It's going to go up, it's going to go down, it's going to be weird. But to make sure in the beginning is to make sure that the liquid is completely covered the food particles. You don't want anything floating on top. You don't want any of the leaves below the water line. All of that will negatively impact it. Now this is called a pickle pebble. It's a glass weight is all that it is. And these are down in my Amazon store. All the fermentation stuff is in my Amazon store. But you can also use other things, anything that's going to weigh it down. Like I've seen people use the little small mason jars filled with water or rice or something like that, sealed, closed, and then put inside the center here as a weight, but you just need something that's going to behave like a weight. And so I just put my pickle pebble in there, and then I'm going to search around and make sure that none of the little stuff floated to the top, which I see a little bit floating to the top. Now normally this weight will stop anything from floating to the top as well. If the liquid, see, even with the weight, I still don't have a good amount of liquid in here. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit of water to it, not enough to mess up the salt, which is okay because if you remember, we did 16 grams and we were supposed to do 14 grams of salt. So I have a little bit of leeway. So I'm going to allow a little bit of water. I'm not going to use sink water or city water because there's chlorine in it and that can be detrimental to fermentations. I'm going to use filtered water, and that's just filtered from my fridge. That should be good enough. You can use bottled water, you can use all kinds of waters. Just if you're going to use your sink's water, you're going to need to let it sit out for 24 hours so that the chlorine can dissipate. Okay, I've added water and I'm just going to stir it around a little bit just to make sure it's making contact with everything in here. I also want to kind of get rid of any air bubbles that are in there. Oh, I might have to add a little bit more. That was probably a tablespoon. Now that I'm trying to get the air bubbles out, I'm realizing that I probably need about 2 tablespoons. Yeah. If you don't have a weight and you don't have anything that can behave as a weight, you can actually put a leaf of cabbage over top of this, like the whole leaf, and it will create like a barrier. Okay, let's try that. I added about another tablespoon of water. We're going to put the weight on there. It's almost too much, but it's actually perfect now. The weight is, you can see the weight is almost equal to the size of the jar. So it keeps everything that's floating below the line. Now that we're done with our pickle pebbles, we're going to talk about the next thing, which is a fermentation lid. You don't have to use these, just like with the pickle pebbles. This just makes it easier, you know, than using something else or using the cabbage leaf or the little mason jar. These vents, they're vents. What they have on the top of them are these little openings. Kind of reminds me of a baby bottle nipple. And the point of these is so that when gases accumulate in here, the little nipple pops open and releases the gas, but it doesn't allow any gas to come back in. I think it's the same concept for baby bottles. So we're going to place that on top, and we're going to screw our band on. These are the wide mouth fermentation lids. There's different kinds of fermentation lids. There's kind that have airlocks. I don't like those because once I put them on and put them in my cabinet, they can't fit in my cabinet. But a lot of people do love those. If you have a wider, a taller cabinet space than I do, that's going to be fine. But I find these easy to store. They're rubber, easy to clean. You can put them in the dishwasher. They're great, and they work every time. So now that we got this guy on there, some other options that you have if you don't want to buy one is that you can put cheesecloth over the top. You can put, I've done coffee filters over the top. That works really well, especially if you have those cone coffee filters. Not the baskets work okay too, but the cone ones work really well too because they're almost like a little bit thicker. Anything that's going to be breathable yet not let bacteria in from outside, that's going to work perfectly. You also have the option of actually putting a full lid on here. Let me preface that. If you put a full lid on here, it's not going to have a way for air to escape. So to let it escape, you're going to have to open up the lid every day to let the gas escape. And you have to remember to do it every single day, because if you don't, I'm here to tell you it will explode because the gases will accumulate and they'll have nowhere to go. And so eventually those gases will build up and the jar will crack and break. So don't do that. Don't pull a me. Now, I do one other thing, which is I get a bowl or a plate or something that I can set this in, because these liquids in here do, like I said, go up and down. I mentioned this earlier. They go up and down. And so because of that, sometimes it will push fluid out through the top of the nipple and sometimes it won't. So I do this just in case, to make sure that I'm not going to have this sauerkraut liquid all over my cabinet. Then the last thing that I do is I mark on the jar. I just use these dry erase markers. We have a little dry erase board that we write like what we need to buy from the grocery store. So I use these things, and I'm just going to mark the date on here. I have my jar filled. I have my cabbage in there. I got my date. I got my plate. Now is the last step, which is this is going to go in a dark cabinet in your kitchen, and it's going to sit for, I'm going to start with 5 days, and then I'll check it every 3 days after that. So I just put a little reminder on my phone. So I'm going to wait for 5 days, and then I'm going to take it out and I'm going to taste it and see how it tastes. And if it's not tangy enough, which is usually what happens with mine, they're not tangy, they're a little salty, I'll just keep letting it go until it does get to the right tang. The last one I did, because it was winter, it took 30 days. So don't be surprised. It could be ready as early as 5 days, but it could take as long as 30. Some people I've seen, it takes 60. So it really depends on the climate in your house. We keep it cold at my house. My husband he runs warm. So we keep our house very cold, which is probably why it takes longer. So let's put him in the cabinet. Now I come in this cabinet just about every day because I'm grabbing jars, or I'm grabbing my scale or something for my tea. And so I go in here every couple of days at worst case, and so it's always here. And you see here, here's where we have that oregano oil that's working. I come in here when I see it and kind of shake it and put it back into place. And then that also has a date on it too. That's all there is to it. I hope you guys had fun with me cleaning out the garden, getting a bunch of stuff harvested in the fridge and ready to eat, making our sauerkraut, planting our tomatoes. I had an awesome time. I hope you guys had fun too. Happy gardening, guys.